My name is Cora, and I'm 62 years old. Last Thanksgiving, I thought I was finally going to have the perfect holiday with my son Marcus and his family in Boston. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, planning every detail from the cranberry sauce recipe my late husband Robert loved to the apple pie that had been in our family for 3 generations. But when I arrived at Marcus's house, there was something that made my heart sink. My old brown suitcase was already sitting in the hallway, packed and ready to go. I hadn't even unpacked from my trip yet. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and please hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, this story will show you just how much a mother's love can surprise everyone. 3 years ago, my world changed forever when my husband Robert passed away from a sudden stroke. We had been married for 32 beautiful years, and he left me our cozy house in Vermont, along with a lifetime of memories. I had worked as a nurse for most of my adult life, spending countless hours caring for patients in their final days. It taught me about the preciousness of life and the importance of family bonds. But long before Robert, I had already learned what it meant to be strong. I raised Marcus mostly on my own after divorcing his biological father when Marcus was just 7 years old. His father had walked out on us, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and unpaid bills. Those early years were tough, but Marcus and I became a team. I worked double shifts at the hospital, sometimes 3 jobs at once, just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. I would come home exhausted, but Marcus would always greet me with his gap-toothed smile and a drawing he had made at school. We would sit at our small kitchen table, and I would help him with his homework while heating up whatever dinner I could manage to throw together. On weekends, I taught him how to cook simple meals, passing down family recipes that my own mother had shared with me. We made cranberry sauce from scratch every Thanksgiving, and he learned to make my grandmother's famous apple pie filling. Marcus would stand on a little wooden stool next to me, his small hands carefully measuring spices, while I guided him through each step. Marcus grew up to be everything I had hoped for. He became a successful accountant in Boston, married a wonderful woman named Elena 5 years ago, and gave me 2 precious grandchildren, Jake, who is 8, and Lily, who is 6. I was so proud of the man he had become. We talked every week on the phone, and he would visit Vermont at least once a month sometimes, bringing the kids to spend weekends with me. During those visits, he would help me with yard work and small repairs around the house, just like he had when he was a teenager. Elena was like the daughter I never had. She would call me just to chat about recipes or ask for advice about the children. When Marcus married her, I felt like my family was finally complete again. She had this wonderful way of making me feel included in their daily lives, sending me photos of the children and asking for my opinion on everything from birthday party themes to discipline strategies. I loved watching Jake play soccer through video calls and helping Lily practice reading over the phone. So when Elena called me 2 weeks before Thanksgiving and invited me to spend the holiday with them in Boston, I was overjoyed. She said they wanted to start a new tradition with me as the centerpiece of their celebration. I immediately began planning what I would bring. I spent days preparing Marcus's favorite cornbread stuffing, the one with sage and celery that Robert used to say was better than his own mother's recipe. I bought special gifts for Jake and Lily, little wooden toys that I had found at a local craft shop in Vermont. For Jake, I found a wooden airplane that reminded me of the model planes Marcus used to build, and for Lily, a beautiful wooden dollhouse complete with tiny furniture. I even wrote down the apple pie recipe on special paper so that Elena could keep it for future generations. The recipe card was decorated with little drawings of apples and rolling pins, something I thought would make it feel more special and personal. I imagined Elena and the children using it for years to come, creating their own memories around the same traditions that had brought my family together. The 3-hour drive from Vermont to Boston felt like it took forever. I kept the radio tuned to the oldies station, humming along to songs that Robert and I used to dance to in our kitchen. I imagined Jake and Lily running to greet me at the door, their faces lighting up when they saw the presents I had brought. I pictured Marcus hugging me tight and telling me how much he had missed me. In my mind, I could already smell the turkey roasting and hear the sound of family laughter filling their home. But something felt wrong from the moment Marcus opened the front door. Usually he would sweep me into one of his bear hugs, the kind that lifted me off my feet and reminded me that he would always be my little boy. This time, his embrace was brief and distracted. His smile seemed forced, and he avoided looking directly into my eyes. When I commented on how handsome he looked, he just mumbled a thanks and stepped back awkwardly. Elena appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, but her usual warm greeting was replaced by a quick peck on the cheek and a hurried excuse about checking on something in the oven. She had always been the type to drop everything and sit with me for at least a few minutes when I arrived, asking about my drive and catching up on Vermont news. Today, she seemed anxious to get back to whatever she was doing, barely making eye contact as she spoke. Even the children seemed different. Jake and Lily were sitting in the living room, glued to their tablets instead of rushing to show me their latest school projects or asking about the stories I always brought from Vermont. Usually they would fight over who got to carry my overnight bag upstairs and who would get the first hug. When I called out their names, they looked up, briefly waved, and immediately returned to their screens. The house felt strangely quiet, lacking the usual chaos and excitement that came with family gatherings. That's when I noticed my old brown suitcase sitting in the hallway. It was the same one I had used for weekend trips to visit them, but seeing it there, already packed and zipped shut, sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't even had a chance to unpack my things yet. The suitcase looked fuller than usual, as if someone had carefully folded and organized more clothes than I typically brought for a holiday weekend. When I asked Marcus about it, he stumbled over his words, saying something about helping me get organized and making sure I had everything ready for when I needed to leave. His explanation felt hollow, and the way Elena quickly looked away when I glanced at her made my stomach knot with anxiety. Marcus had always been a planner, but he had never packed my belongings without asking me first. It felt invasive and presumptuous in a way that didn't match the son I thought I knew. During dinner, the conversation was stilted and awkward. Usually these meals were filled with stories about the children's activities, Marcus's work projects, and Elena's book club adventures. Tonight, however, everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells. Jake picked at his food without his usual enthusiasm, and Lily barely touched her favorite mashed potatoes. The turkey was beautifully prepared, and Elena had clearly spent hours making everything perfect, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. When I tried to engage them in conversation about school, their responses were short and uninspiring. Jake usually loved telling me about his science experiments and soccer games, but today he just shrugged and said everything was fine. Lily, who normally chattered nonstop about her friends and art projects, kept glancing nervously at her parents before giving me one-word answers. Marcus and Elena kept exchanging glances across the table, the kind of silent communication that happens between couples when they're sharing a secret. I had brought my famous cranberry sauce, the one Marcus had loved since he was a child, but he barely took a spoonful. Elena complimented the food, but her praise felt automatic, lacking the genuine appreciation she usually showed for my cooking. The cornbread stuffing that had always been Marcus's favorite sat mostly untouched on his plate. I found myself watching the clock, wondering why everyone seemed so eager for the evening to end. This wasn't the warm family gathering I had been anticipating for weeks. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening. The house was old, and sounds traveled easily through the thin walls. Around midnight, I heard Marcus and Elena talking quietly in the kitchen. At first, I tried to ignore their conversation, respecting their privacy, but certain words drifted up to my room and caught my attention. The word tomorrow was mentioned several times, along with phrases I couldn't quite make out. I heard Marcus say something about having everything ready and that he had already prepared my suitcase. My heart began to race as I strained to listen more carefully. The tone of their conversation was serious, almost businesslike, which was unusual for late-night talks between husband and wife. Elena's voice was softer, but I caught fragments of what she was saying about a place in Connecticut with good reviews and comfortable accommodations. The word facility made my blood run cold, and when Marcus mentioned something about financial burden and not being able to provide proper care, I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I sat up in bed, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I was hearing. These weren't the voices of a loving son and daughter-in-law discussing holiday plans. These were the voices of people making arrangements for someone else's life. I crept to the top of the stairs, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, my hands shaking as I gripped the banister. Their voices became clearer, and what I heard shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. Marcus was talking about a nursing home, describing it as a beautiful place where I would be well cared for and have people my own age to socialize with. He spoke about it like he was describing a vacation resort, emphasizing the activities and the professional staff. Elena was discussing the cost and how they had already submitted an application. She mentioned that they had visited the facility the previous weekend and spoken with the admissions coordinator. They talked about my house in Vermont, suggesting it was too big for me to manage alone and that the money from selling it could help pay for my care. Elena said something about a realtor who specialized in estate sales for seniors. The worst part was hearing Marcus describe me as a responsibility he could no longer handle. He talked about how I was getting older and that it would be better for everyone if I was in a professional care environment. He mentioned concerns about me living alone, driving long distances, and managing household tasks. Every word felt like a dagger to my heart because none of it was true. I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself, managing my finances, and living independently. Marcus even talked about the timing, saying that Thanksgiving weekend would be perfect because they could drive me to Connecticut on Friday and get me settled before the week started. Elena agreed, mentioning that they had already scheduled a tour and intake appointment for Friday morning. They discussed how to break the news to me with Elena, suggesting they present it as a temporary arrangement until they could figure out a better long-term solution. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the guest room chair, staring out at the Boston skyline and thinking about what I needed to do. Sleep was impossible after what I had overheard. My mind raced through decades of memories, from the sacrifices I had made raising Marcus to the dreams Robert and I had shared for our golden years. I thought about the house in Vermont, filled with furniture we had chosen together, and rooms where Marcus had grown up. I remembered working 3 jobs to pay for his college tuition and turning down marriage proposals because I wanted to focus entirely on being the best mother I could be. There was David, the kind hardware store owner who had asked me out dozens of times when Marcus was in high school. I had liked him, but I was afraid that bringing another man into our lives might confuse or upset Marcus during his formative years. I chose to put my son's needs first, just as I had done with everything else. As dawn approached, I made my decision. If Marcus thought I needed to be managed like a helpless child, I would show him exactly how capable and independent his mother really was. I wasn't going to wait around for them to present their nursing home plan over breakfast. I wasn't going to sit through some rehearsed conversation where they explained how this was all for my own good. Instead, I was going to leave on my own terms and show them what real independence looked like. I quietly gathered my belongings, moving carefully to avoid waking anyone. I had brought more clothes than usual for this trip, planning to stay through the weekend, so I had plenty of essentials. I packed my medications, my favorite sweater that Robert had given me, and the small photo album I always carried with pictures of our family through the years. I left behind the gifts I had brought for Jake and Lily, hoping they might remember their grandmother fondly when they opened them. Then I sat at the guest room desk and began writing a letter to my son. The words came slowly at first, but then they poured out of me like water from a broken dam. I wrote about love and respect, about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. I told him about the life Robert and I had built and the future I still wanted to live. The letter grew to 3 pages as I poured out everything I was feeling. "Marcus, my dear son," I began, "thank you for being so thoughtful and packing my suitcase for me. I can see that you put a lot of care into making sure I had everything I needed for my journey. However, I think there has been some confusion about what kind of journey I'm taking. You seem to believe that because I am 62 years old and recently widowed, I have somehow become incapable of making decisions about my own life." I continued writing my pen, moving across the paper with determination. "I want you to know that I heard your conversation with Elena last night about the nursing home in Connecticut. I learned that this entire Thanksgiving invitation was not about spending time with family, but about implementing a plan you made without my knowledge or consent. You talked about me like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a woman who has successfully navigated 62 years of life." The letter grew longer as I shared memories of our life together. I reminded him of the nights I worked double shifts at the hospital to pay for his hockey equipment, the times I went without new clothes, so he could have school supplies, and the way I supported his dreams even when they took him far from home. I wrote about Robert and the plans we had made to grow old together in Vermont, surrounded by the life we had built with our own hands. "I understand that you love me and want what you think is best for me," I continued, "but love without respect is not really love at all. It is control dressed up in good intentions. I am not ready to be put away somewhere to be managed by strangers. I still have dreams to pursue, places to see, and a life to live on my own terms. Since you have already packed my suitcase and made it clear that I am no longer welcome as an independent member of this family, I am taking your hint and leaving." I ended the letter with words that came straight from my broken heart. "I will always love you, Marcus, but I cannot stay where I am, not trusted to make my own choices. Maybe someday you will understand that being a good son means supporting your mother's decisions, not making them for her. Until then, I will be living the life that Robert and I always planned, just without him by my side." At 6 o'clock in the morning, I placed the letter on the kitchen table where Marcus would be sure to find it with his morning coffee. I took one last look around the house where my grandchildren lived, kissed my fingertips and touched the family photo on the mantel, and quietly slipped out the front door. My suitcase was already packed, just as Marcus had intended, though not for the destination he had planned. I drove away from Boston with tears streaming down my face, but also with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Robert died. The morning was cold and gray, matching my mood perfectly. Marcus wouldn't discover my letter for at least 2 hours, giving me a significant head start before he realized what had happened. I had no specific destination in mind, only a burning need to put distance between myself and the son who had tried to steal my autonomy. About an hour after I left, my phone began ringing. Marcus's name appeared on the screen again and again, but I wasn't ready to talk to him. The phone sat on the passenger seat, buzzing insistently as call after call came through. I could imagine him standing in his kitchen, holding my letter with shaking hands, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had planned to do to me. Elena was probably there too, both of them realizing that their carefully orchestrated scheme had backfired spectacularly. The phone calls continued throughout the morning, joined by text messages that grew increasingly desperate. "Mom, please call me back. I'm so sorry, I never meant for you to find out this way. Please, tell me where you are so I can explain." But there was nothing to explain. I had heard everything I needed to hear the night before when he thought I was safely asleep and unaware of his plans. I drove north toward Vermont, but when I reached the exit for my hometown, I kept going. The house Robert and I had shared suddenly felt like a trap, the first place Marcus would look when he realized I wasn't answering my phone. Instead, I continued driving, following signs toward highways I had never traveled, heading toward a future I would create entirely on my own. Marcus called Elena's phone too, and when she tried calling me, I could hear the panic in his voice through her voicemails. "She's not answering. The letter, Elena. What have we done? She heard everything we said last night. She knows about the nursing home, about our plans. How could I have been so stupid?" His voice cracked with emotion, and despite my anger, part of my heart ached for his pain. But this was a pain of his own making. For months, he had been making decisions about my life without including me in the conversation. He had researched facilities, filled out applications, and planned my future like I was a piece of furniture to be relocated rather than a human being with feelings and preferences. The fact that he was now experiencing consequences for those choices was not my responsibility to fix. I stopped at a rest area in New Hampshire to stretch my legs and think about what to do next. Other families were traveling for the holiday, loading and unloading cars filled with suitcases and casserole dishes. Children ran around the parking lot while their parents fueled up for long drives to family gatherings. I watched them and wondered how many of those adult children truly respected their aging parents, and how many saw them as burdens to be managed. A young mother was helping her elderly father into their car, speaking to him with such gentleness and respect. She asked him if he was comfortable, if he needed anything, if he wanted to stop anywhere along the way. This was how adult children should treat their parents, I thought, with dignity and consideration, not as problems to be solved. For 2 weeks, Marcus searched for me desperately. He drove to Vermont multiple times, checking our house and talking to neighbors who hadn't seen me. He called my few remaining friends, my former colleagues at the hospital, and even contacted the police to file a missing person report. But I was 62 years old, had left voluntarily, and had taken my car and belongings with me. There was no crime to investigate, only a son who had lost his mother's trust and was facing the consequences of his actions. During this time, I had driven clear across the country to California, where my nursing school friend Patricia lived in a small coastal town. Patricia had moved west 30 years ago after her divorce and had built a new life for herself working with hospice patients. When I showed up on her doorstep, exhausted and heartbroken, she welcomed me with open arms and no questions asked. She understood that sometimes a woman needs to reinvent herself regardless of her age. Patricia's house was a small cottage, painted bright yellow with window boxes full of flowers. She had always been the free spirit among our nursing school friends, the one who talked about traveling the world and living unconventionally. When her marriage ended, she had done exactly that, moving to California and creating a life that was entirely her own. She was the perfect person to help me figure out how to do the same thing. I found a small apartment 3 blocks from the ocean, furnished it with pieces from local thrift stores, and began creating a life that was entirely my own. The apartment was on the second floor of a converted Victorian house with tall windows that let in beautiful natural light. For the first time in decades, every decision I made was mine alone. I could eat dinner at 9 o'clock in the evening or breakfast at 2 in the afternoon. I could leave dishes in the sink overnight or reorganize my closet at midnight if the mood struck me. These small freedoms felt revolutionary after years of being defined primarily as someone's wife or mother. I bought groceries without considering anyone else's preferences. I chose a bright red couch because I loved the color, not because it matched any existing furniture. I hung pictures wherever I wanted them and played music as loud as I pleased. Every choice, no matter how small, reminded me that this was my life to live. I volunteered at the local hospital using my nursing skills to comfort patients who were facing their final days. The work reminded me that life is precious and finite and that wasting time on people who don't appreciate your worth is a luxury none of us can afford. I worked with terminal patients and their families, helping them navigate some of the most difficult conversations and decisions of their lives. It was meaningful work that made me feel useful and valued. I also enrolled in a watercolor painting class, something I had always wanted to try but never had time for when I was busy caring for everyone else. The class met twice a week in a bright studio overlooking the harbor. Our instructor was a patient woman named Dorothy who had been painting for 50 years. She taught us to see light and shadow, to mix colors that captured the mood of a moment, to be brave with our brushstrokes. My apartment had a small balcony that faced the ocean, and I spent hours watching the waves and seagulls while working on my paintings. I painted sunsets and sailboats, flowers from Patricia's garden, and sometimes abstract pieces that captured emotions I couldn't put into words. The art became a form of therapy, a way to process the hurt and anger I felt about Marcus's betrayal, while also exploring the joy of my newfound independence. Marcus continued calling, but I wasn't ready to forgive him yet. I needed time to heal from the betrayal and to prove to myself that I could thrive independently. His voicemails gradually changed from angry demands for me to come home to tearful apologies and pleas for forgiveness. Elena called too, leaving messages about how sorry she was and how much the children missed their grandmother. The hardest part was missing Jake and Lily. I thought about them every day, wondering if they understood why I had disappeared from their lives. I imagined them asking where I was and what their parents told them. But I also knew that staying in a situation where I was treated like a burden wouldn't have been good for them to witness. Children need to see their grandparents treated with respect and dignity, managed like inconvenient responsibilities. On a Thursday afternoon in December, I was returning from my painting class when I found Marcus sitting on the steps of my apartment building. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in weeks. His usually neat appearance was disheveled. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes were red and swollen. He was holding a bouquet of yellow roses, my favorite flowers, the ones Robert used to bring me for special occasions. When he saw me approaching, he stood up slowly, and I could see that his hands were shaking. The confident, successful man who had tried to control my life had been replaced by someone who looked broken and lost. For a moment, I felt the familiar maternal instinct to comfort him, but I forced myself to remember why I was here. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "please, don't walk away from me." I stopped about 10 feet from him, still holding my art supplies and canvas bag, and looked at this man who was my son but had become a stranger to me. "How did you find me?" "Patricia finally called me yesterday," he said. "She said she thought enough time had passed and that you might be ready to listen." He held out the roses with trembling hands. "I've been sitting here since 6 this morning, hoping you'd come home." I didn't take the flowers immediately. Looking at him, I could see genuine remorse in his expression, but I had been hurt too deeply to simply forgive and forget. "What do you want, Marcus?" He dropped to his knees, right there on the sidewalk, tears streaming down his face. People walking by stopped to stare at the scene we were creating, but Marcus didn't seem to care about the public spectacle. "I want to apologize for being the worst son in the world. I want to beg your forgiveness for treating you like you were helpless when you're the strongest person I know. I want to take back every terrible decision I made and every word I said about putting you in a nursing home." The raw emotion in his voice was unmistakable, and I could see that his pain was real. "I realize now that I was trying to control your life because I was scared of losing you. After Dad died, I kept thinking about what would happen if something happened to you too. Instead of talking to you about my fears, I decided I needed to manage your life to keep you safe. I was so wrong, Mom, so incredibly wrong." I finally accepted the roses and sat down on the steps beside him. The flowers smelled like forgiveness and second chances, but I wasn't ready to give either just yet. "You scared me too, Marcus. For a few hours I thought the son I raised had completely disappeared. I found your letter the morning after you left," he continued, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I read it probably 50 times, and each time I understood more clearly how badly I had betrayed your trust. Elena and I drove to Vermont immediately, but you were gone. I called everyone I could think of, filed police reports, hired a private investigator. I was terrified that I had lost you forever." We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the California sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed, and I could hear the distant sound of waves breaking on the shore. This place had become my sanctuary, and having Marcus here felt like an intrusion into the peace I had worked so hard to create. Finally, I spoke. "I need you to understand something, Marcus. I am not ready to give up my independence, and I may never be ready. I am perfectly capable of making decisions about my own life, including where I want to live and how I want to spend my remaining years." "I know that now," he said earnestly, his voice stronger, but still filled with regret. "I can see how well you're doing here, how much happier you look than you did even before Dad died. I was wrong to assume that you needed me to take care of you. You've been taking care of yourself and everyone around you for your entire life. I should have trusted you to know what was best for you." I told him about my apartment, my volunteer work, and my painting classes. I showed him photos on my phone of the watercolor landscapes I had been creating. "This is the life I want to live right now," I explained. "I'm not running away from family, but I am choosing to prioritize my own happiness for the first time in decades." Marcus nodded, his eyes filling with tears again as he looked at the paintings. "They're beautiful, Mom. You're so talented. I never knew you wanted to paint." "There are a lot of things you don't know about me," I said gently. "Things I gave up or put aside to raise you and take care of our family. I'm not angry about those sacrifices, but I'm not willing to sacrifice any more of my life to make other people comfortable." He reached for my hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I let him take it. "Will you consider letting me be part of your life again? Not as someone who makes decisions for you, but as your son, who loves and respects the woman who taught him everything important he knows." I looked at this man who had broken my heart and was now asking for the chance to earn back my trust. The roses in my lap reminded me of all the good times we had shared, all the love that had existed between us before fear and misguided protection had poisoned our relationship. "I'm willing to try," I said finally, "but things will be different. I'm staying in California. You can visit, but you can't try to convince me to move closer to you. I will make my own choices about my future, including if and when I might need more help as I get older." He agreed to my terms immediately, promising to respect my independence and to include me in any discussions about my well-being, rather than making plans behind my back. We talked for another hour on those apartment steps, beginning the slow process of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. Marcus flew back to Boston the next day, but not before meeting Patricia and seeing my apartment. He admitted that I seemed more vibrant and alive than I had in years. Elena called that evening to apologize personally, and we had a long conversation about boundaries and communication. She promised that any future discussions about my welfare would include me as an equal participant rather than the subject of decisions made by others. The children were confused about why I had disappeared, but Elena helped them understand that sometimes adults need space to figure things out. I started calling them regularly, sharing stories about my new life and sending them paintings of seashells and dolphins. Jake became fascinated by my art and asked if I could teach him to paint when they visited for Christmas. 6 months later, I'm still living in California, still volunteering at the hospital, and still taking art classes. Marcus visits every few months, and I can see that he has learned to relate to me as an adult woman rather than as his responsibility. Our relationship is different now, built on respect and genuine affection rather than guilt and obligation. I think about Robert often and imagine him smiling at my independence. He always said I was the strongest person he knew, and I think he would be proud that I finally learned to prioritize my own happiness. The yellow roses Marcus brought me are pressed between the pages of my art journal. Now, a reminder that love and respect can coexist, and that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are also capable of the greatest growth. Sometimes the best way to show someone you love them is to let them live their own life. And sometimes the best way to teach that lesson is to walk away even when your heart is breaking. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your independence or self-respect? What would you have done in my situation? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Please, give this video a like if my story touched your heart because it helps other people find these real-life stories. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family love and finding strength in the most unexpected moments. And please, share this with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to choose your own path and stand up for yourself. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and remember that every stage of life can be a beautiful new beginning if you have the courage to embrace it. Wishing you all the strength to live life on your own terms.